Now, the next author that's going to read to us, Hennie Lombard. Hennie is always the guy with the long black hair that skulks in the corner very mysteriously. And I have always been trying to figure him out, never been able to. I've worked with him in his capacity as a photographer, but today, lo and behold, he writes. Who would have thought? He writes for a living as well, though he writes stories, and his boss would probably take a lot of offense if we said he wrote fiction.
Hello everybody. I should probably explain I write speeches among other things for a political party, so this is my fiction, I promise. This is an extract from a short story, just to give some context. Prior to this point, our hero wakes up, he gains consciousness, and he's disorientated, he's not sure where he is. Eventually he realizes, well, this noise over his head is an ambulance siren, he must be in an ambulance, and this voice chattering to him is not him being insane, it's the paramedic sitting somewhere out of sight. He doesn't feel pain, but he can't feel his body, so he's entirely paralyzed, except his eyes are open. The ambulance overtook another vehicle, and Michael's head rolled slightly to one side. His eyes traveled over the assorted equipment strapped to the side of the ambulance interior. He couldn't move to see what was happening below his neck, but at least it seemed that he didn't require all of that equipment. Good news, perhaps? His eyes caught movement on the wall and focused on the back of the kidney pan attached snugly to the side of the ambulance near his head. It took a moment for his befuddled brain to process the picture. He was seeing a weirdly magnified reflection of the paramedic sitting by his legs on the other side of the gurney. He watched bemused as the paramedic raised a hand. It held a fork with a small piece of food at the end, which he daintily put in his mouth. Michael started to lose his temper about this guy eating from the gurney he was lying on. But then he had to smile inwardly at the eccentric way the man held his fork with the pinky pointing off at an absurd angle. Besides, it wasn't as if there were any other flat surfaces around to eat from, and even paramedics had to eat sometime, right? It explained the ill-disguised belch he had heard earlier, as well as the man's periodic silences, even though he was obviously capable of talking non-stop for hours on end. When the paramedic had swallowed, Michael watched him carefully putting the fork down and wipe lightly with a pinky at the corner of his mouth. The paramedic recommenced his monologue with his paralyzed patient, whom he presumably didn't realize was conscious. There's no point in fighting an addiction such as ours, just putting yourself through misery, I've discovered. Michael watched in the reflected surface of the kidney pan as the paramedic's hands came up, one holding a fork and the other holding a knife. No, not a knife. What the hell? He's eating with a scalpel? The mind's capacity for denial is immense. Michael had not once until now focused on his own body in the reflection, even though the paramedic was essentially background detail on the other side of it. Now he looked, and his eyes wouldn't stop looking. This couldn't be. Where was his body? It looked like he was wrapped in the mangled carcass of a large animal, with only his neck and head sticking out at the one end. He wanted to turn his head away, or close his eyes, but he couldn't. That's not my body. Oh, please. No, 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 no. What happened? Everything. All the inside stuff, his mind screamed, was hanging out. It looked like his whole upper body had exploded from the inside, spilling a lyrically colored mixture of entrails and organs over the gurney. He experienced a split-second flashback of crashing the motorbike. The paramedic leaned slightly forward and brought the scalpel and fork down, throwing a sidelong glance at Michael, and set about cutting a piece of meat from among his exposed organs. Michael couldn't take his eyes off this surreal scene, but some instinctive part of him revolted and overcame his paralysis. His hip bucked once. From that distant continent that was his body below the neck, a faint telegram of pain arrived. The paramedic's head turned towards Michael's head, and when he didn't find Michael staring at him, rolled his eyes extravagantly. He popped a piece of Michael into his mouth and chewed. His eyes grew slightly askew and an expression of deep satisfaction came over his face. His eyes drifted over the side of the ambulance and suddenly noticed Michael's reflection staring with wide-eyed horror back at him. The paramedic swallowed heavily and the fingertips of one hand flew to cover his mouth, which formed a perfect O. After a moment, the paramedic composed his face and dropped his hand. A trickle of blood painted a thin red line from the corner of the paramedic's mouth to the end of his chin. Honestly, I like my meat fresh, but having the food stare at me like that is disturbing. It's supposed to be funny. The perfectly manicured pinky wiped at the corners of the mouth. He looked at his fingertip and noticed the black there. He studied himself in the reflection of the scalpel and carefully wiped away the rest of the smear. Then he put the pinky in his mouth and delicately sucked it clean. He smiled. What not? Waste not.